Giovanni Dellantonio. Connection between antiquarian interests and Renaissance art at the southern boundaries of the empire. Trento between the 15th and 16th centuries. Between the middle of the 15th and mid-16th centuries, before becoming known throughout the world for the important event of the Great Council, the city of Trento and its episcopal principality was governed by a series of bishops all bound to the Habsburg court and bound to the Germanic Empire and all singularly interested in the memories and studies of Roman antiquity. On the lower left, we see the position of the bishopric principality on the southern borders of the Germanic Empire. On the right we see a perspective view of the city of Trento as it was presented at the time of the council. Trento, Trient in German, is a city of Roman origin and system, known in antiquity by the name of Tridentum. The red box indicates the extension of the Roman city, and marked in blue we see the positions of the Cardo and the Decumanus Maximus, which took into account the presence of the course of the river Adige, called Ech in German. Some remains of the ancient Roman Tridentum were still visible during the Renaissance. For example, some sculpted stones with friezes, and in particular with the trident, which the scholars of the late Renaissance connected with the god Neptune, had been presumably inserted between the 14th and 15th centuries on the north outer wall of St. Vigilio's Cathedral facing the main square of the city. Johannes Hinderbach, born in Rauschenberg near Marburg, here we see a detail of his gravestone, was a colleague of Ennius Silvio Piccolomini, later Pope Pius II, at the court of Frederick III, Holy Roman Emperor. A keen reader of Flavio Biondo, Hinderbach also read and transcribed epigraphs of Roman times both during his travels in Italy, which also included Trentino, and carried out a series of works of art that are based on the example of Roman antiquity. Johannes Hinderbach came into contact with several humanists of the Venetian area, particularly with Trieste's poet Raffaele Zuvenzoni. To the left, we see the miniature image of Zuvenzoni, which accompanied the codex that collected his poetic work entitled Distrias, dedicated to the Bishop of Trento, with a decorated letter that we see on the right. Hinderbach also cultivated friendship with the antiquarius par excellence of the second half of the 15th century, the Veronese Felice Feliciano, the friend of painters Andrea Mantegna and both Gentile and Giovanni Bellini, well known by those who deal with the art of calligraphy, the press and the collection of epigraphs of Roman times in the Renaissance. The most extraordinary work of art made by Bishop Hinderbach is certainly the stone mirror, once protected by a metal or wooden door, placed next to the loggia of the Buonconsiglio castle, directly near the door giving access to the private rooms of the prince. The central part of this convex and shiny object, the true reflective mirror, is made of black stone and is surrounded by a light stone ring frame, inserted in turn, within an elaborate rose-colored outdoor frame with a concentric band and vegetable decorations on the corners. The element that adds value to this truly unique object in Renaissance art is the inscription in Greek capital letters and Roman capitals, Genothi se autonidist cognoscete ipsum. This sentence reports and explains the famous saying that according to the description of the theologian Hugh of St. Victor, who lived in the 12th century, and the probable source of information for the Bishop of Trent on the subject, was found on the tripod of Apollo at the Delphi temple in ancient Greece. At the time I proposed to attribute the conception of this extraordinary object to Felice Feliciano alone. In my opinion, it is enough to compare the graphic layout of the title page of his codex kept in the National Library of Florence, which he made and marked with concentric bands, and to consider his interest in the study of ancient epigraphs, which led Feliciano to write a treatise on the geometric construction of the lapidary capital letters of the Latin alphabet, contained in the famous codex called Alphabetum Romanum of the Vatican Library of Rome, to adequately substantiate this hypothesis. Johannes Hinderbach was also a passionate fan of antique studies. He himself defined himself rerum vetustarum studiosus. During his trips to Italy he carefully observed the vestiges of antiquity, and was worried that the popes allowed the ancient monuments of Rome to be used as stone quarries of construction. Even in Trentino he carefully studied the ancient testimonies, for example by examining a sarcophagus preserved in Toblino Castle, where the epigraph of Roman age for Druino was also walled, which we see in the image on the left. Towards 1470 Hinderbach recovered and exhibited inside the Church of Flavin, in Val di Non, what the 16th century scholars like Giano Piero Pincio mistakenly believed to be the burial of Bishop Massimino, who lived in the 7th century AD, characterized by the elegant presence of two heroes holding the epigraphic mirror surrounded by a vegetable garland. A proof of the sharing of antiquity interest in bishopric circles at the end of the 15th century is the funeral monument that the learned jurist Calipini, who died in 1485, was preparing for himself in the Trento Cathedral. We see it in the picture on the right. Winged geniuses with spread wings bearing the coat of arms of the noble Trentino constitute a clear reference to Antiquarian design. Closely tied to Bishop Hinderbach like Calipini was also the Brescian doctor Giovanni Tiberino, who was known to have been engaged in the celebration of the Simone child who Hinderbach wanted to believe was killed by members of the Jewish community of Trento. Tiberius had a manuscript code that a note reminds us was dedicated by him to the successor to Hinderbach, Prince Bishop Ulrich von Frühneuzeit. The code contains the transcript of the De Litteris Antiquis by Valerio Probo and the transcription of a series of ancient epigraphs largely transcribed personally from Tiberius in Italy and elsewhere. A descriptive note recalls in particular that at the ancient Roman city of Salona, Dalmatia, Giovanni Tiberino transcribed a bronze table which was said to have been newly found and which in fact provided a military diploma granted by Roman Emperor Domitiano. This ancient object in the Renaissance attracted the attention of several antiquarians, coming first to Venice, then to the sumptuous collections of the Medici family in Florence. On the right we see a depiction of a Roman military diploma engraved on a bronze table again found in Salona, similar to what attracted the curiosity of Tiberino. The personality of Bishop Ulrich von Frühneuzeit, buried in a beautiful tomb in the Trento Cathedral, on the left, and who had been preparing while still alive in 1487 an epitaph in the Augsburg Cathedral, which was then canonical, on the right, has not so far been given much consideration by scholars, also because it was left in the shadows by the reputation of his brother, Georg von Frühneuzeit, the famous Landsknecht leader. As the 16th-century historian Giano Piero Pincio briefly recalled, Ulrich von Frühneuzeit was a fierce defender of the rights of his episcopal principality, and after a hard confrontation with the Archduke of Austria who had usurped him, he succeeded in successfully returning its lucrative tithing rights to the exploitation of the Trentino mines. The coat of arms of Ulrich von Frühneuzeit on some of Trentino buildings shows that it continued in the architectural works started by Hinderbach, while the beautiful inscription in ancient capitals letters that accompanies the coat of arms of the Prince Bishop of Trento on a so-called peace, that is, the tablet for the kiss of peace before the communion, now encapsulated in an ostensory, which he performed in 1491 in a time preserved at the chapel of St. George in Mindelberg, near Mindelheim, his birthplace in southwestern Bavaria, suggests he could really appreciate the antiquarian culture of Tiberius and the gift of Probo's code that he made him. Another important testimony of cultural relations, interests and, in essence, the personality of Ulrich von Frühneuzeit, which seems to me to have so far gone completely unnoticed, at least in Trentino, is constituted by the letter preceded by the prolific printer and publisher Erhard Rachtold of Augsburg to the treatise entitled Compilatio Leopoldi Ducatus Austri Village, de Astrorum Scientia he printed in 1489, of which we see the title piece. Apart from the usual courteous tones that characterize this kind of literary production, the letter of dedication tells us that the Prince-Bishop of Trent must have financially supported the challenging publication of the medieval treatise devoted to astronomy and astrology. The many illustrations, antiquarian in taste, are highly valued in the beautiful colored copy of the book currently stored in the Herzog August Bibliothek by Wolfenbüttel as we see in the image on the right. Between the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century, the plaque with the inscription for Druino preserved in Tablino Castle, which contains an invocation to the female and male fairies, called Fate and Fati, also attracted the attention of the learned members of the Tabarelli family, who added the epithet of Fatis to their name in order to stand out from their relatives living in the countryside. On the hunt for public assignments as expert jurists and high ecclesiastical offices too, the Tabarelli de Fatis attempted to give their apparently unstoppable social ascendance within the Trentino society of the time, claiming to descend from a noble line that had roots in antiquity. In the heart of the city of Trento the Tabarelli built an imposing building, founded on the remains of the Roman Tridentum. And on the architraves of the facade stone-carved medallions were made with the effigy of the 12 Caesars of ancient Rome and powerful men of their time, such as Ferdinand I and Charles V of Habsburg, as well as the bishops of Trento Giorgio Nadek, which we see in the picture on the right, and Bernard Glaise. Even at the end of the 15th century, when the family thus strengthened its feudal power in the valleys of western Trentino, also through marriage, it wanted to improve its social status with its own ancient ancestry. In a fresco painting recently found outside the ancient Red Eagle Inn, later called Loconda all'Aquiliniera, at San Michele all'Adige, the long writing on the bollard struck by armor, and unfortunately defaced, declares that the giant depicted alongside is the mythical founder of the Thun family who is said to have come to Trentino from Rome. This legendary Thun ancestor, who according to legend, the noble family for the whole 16th century tried to back up with documents and attestations sent to the princely chancellery, was said to have actually arrived in the Alpine valleys of Trentino back in the 4th century following Bishop Vigilio, the future holy martyr and patron of the diocese, sent by Saint Ambrogio to evangelize the still pagan people. Let's go back to Georg von Nadek, friend of Conrad Celtis and member of Sodalita's Literaria Danubiana, governor of the city of Verona on behalf of Maximilian I of Habsburg as well as Bishop of Trento. Nadek also made a series of works of art that explicitly reflect the example of Roman antiquity. Here we see the beautiful painted stone heraldic coat of arms, ruled by angels of unquestionable antiquarian design, which he put on the municipal palace of the city of Riva del Garda. Already active at Maximilian I of Habsburg's court, who in 1508, it must be remembered, crowned himself as modern Roman emperor in the Trento Cathedral, Georg von Nadek commissioned the Veronese painter Giovanni Maria Falconetto another important work of art. These are painted canvases that used to close the chest of a new organ for the cathedral church of the city. On the outside of the doors there are two statues depicting the saints Peter and Paul, placed at the base of the arch of a triumphal arch of ancient form, and explicitly recall two epigraphs in lapidary capitals letters celebrating the Victoria Augusta and what was hoped was Maximilian's I Victoria Eterna against his Italian enemies, first of all Venice. The imperial political and ideological program of this artwork is completed on the inside of the doors. Here the Annunciation to Mary is depicted while on the attic of a new triumphal arch marked by the name of the commissioner in lapidary characters, Nadek, from her family's heraldic coat of arms and from ASPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, type plaque, a bas-relief dominated by the inscription Coronatio Caesaris. The coronation of Caesar correctly depicts Augustus's coronation as is declared by the acronym CA, interpretable as Coronatio Augusti, written at the base of the podium which supports the protagonists of ceremony. At the time of Nádek, between the first and the second decades of the 16th century and under the discreet protection of Maximilian I who had already welcomed him in Padua, Cardinal Adriano Castellesi of Corneto fled from Rome to Trentino. We see the ornate cover of a book with his literary works. Cardinal Castellesi was a cultured man who was very rich and scheming. He was accused among other things of poisoning two of his competitors and having also ordered conspiracies against the Pope, and had left an imposing palace incomplete in the Borgo district near St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This building was attributed to the famous architect Donato Bramante. Adriano Castellesi was appointed collector of the Holy Place for England in 1490 and later, in 1503, cardinal protector of the country. 2 years later he gave the palace under construction to King Henry VII of England as the seat of his ambassadors. In Trentino, Cardinal Castellesi took residence in Riva del Garda where he set out to expand a square at the fortress called La Rocca. In Tione, the township of a parish of western Trentino, he extended the church of which he was the beneficiary. While at Tenno, a small village on the hills overlooking Lake Garda between Riva and Arco where he also lived, he made a beautiful inscription with a coat of arms for a fountain and a beautiful portal for the medieval church of San Lorenzo accompanied by an epigraph in lapidary characters and with its own heraldic enterprise and cardinal insignia. We see this portal as it has been depicted in a 19th century book and how it is presented today. Nádek's successor, Bernard Claes, who also served as Prime Minister of Ferdinand I of Habsburg, invited the great Erasmus from Rotterdam to Trent and tried to buy and bring in the new Trento Grand Palace, the so-called Magno Palazzo along with the Buon Consiglio Castle, the texts, the books and the tombstones, coins and sculptures of the Roman age of Viennese humanist Johannes Cuspinian. To the right we see Cuspinian with his son in a detail of a painting realized by Bernard Strigel towards 1520. Precisely in 1520 while the building was still under construction, Bernardo Claes ordered work to be carried out on the outside of the church of Santa Maria Maggiore, which involved reconstruction of the foundations in an area that held many testimonies to the Roman Tridentum. This work was a beautiful shrine with its heraldic emblems and an ancient epigraph in the most elegant lapidary letters that declared it auctor of the building. In 1524 Bernardo Claes then instructed those in charge to carry out a formal check-up visit to all civilian jurisdictions subject to the principality to censor the episcopal feudal rights to pay attention to the evidence of antiquity. I quote, Debentetium advertere in omnibus locis adque accedent, si reperiantur antiquitate salique vel monumenta antiqua, sive instrumenta antiquissima aliquid dignum memoriae continentia, vel numismata aurea, argentea, vel linea, vel quid aliud memorable, et illud studebant habere, vel nos de his informabunt. End of quote. The protocol that records the results of the visits reveals the discovery of some ancient marble slabs and the transcription of some Roman-era inscriptions, such as the one we see at the center of the slide, found in the church of San Giorgio at Poia in western Trentino. Bernardo Claes was absent from Trento for long periods, and was in Austria and Bohemia to fulfill his duties as imperial advisor and great chancellor of Ferdinand I of Habsburg, and for years, and from a distance, made arrangements for the completion of the construction of the great palace and the library. Also involved in the renovation of all bishopric buildings in the principality's jurisdictions he was a demanding and refined buyer of works of art. This is illustrated, for example, by an ornate casket decorated with so-called pastiglia, a mixture of chalk, flour and egg whites, and currently held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which features on its cover the overlapping coat of cardinals that he received after the 1530, and protected by harps, while on the hips, you can see, scenes from Roman history. Also an architrave made by him for a portal of Selva Castle near Levico, in Valsugana Valley, to the east of Trento on the way to Venice, shows Bernard Oakley's preference for the art and the manner of the ancients, the so-called art all'antica. The griffins that hold the shield with the rampant and paired lions that make up the bishop's family coat of arms are comparable to the griffin of one of the ornate Roman relief sculptures reused in the Middle Ages outside the Church of St. Apollinare in Trento. Even in the pictorial decoration, as well as the architectural design of the Great Palace, Roman antiquity played a decisive role. In the so-called Camera del Torrione di Basso, a part of the Great Palace reusing a cylindrical tower built at the time of the Bishop Hinderbach, the native of Vicenza painter Marcello Fogolino depicted a series of scenes from Roman history. In one of the paintings alongside the main scene there is a sort of shrine with a large niche that houses a statue of stone feminine features, its arms mutilated. This is obviously an ancient detail in an imaginary scene taking place in antiquity. The predilection of Fogolino's buyers for these kinds of depictions is also documented by a print signed by the Vicenza artist, which also shows a female statue with mutilated arms, in the background of a landscape and an ancient architecture. This type of depiction at the time, as well as having many admirers, had to have detractors, too. The physician and botanist of Sienese origin Pietro Andrea Mattioli, a famous scientist of his time and author of real bestsellers translated into many European languages, spent several years in Trento and Trentino after leaving Rome and before moving temporarily to the courts of Vienna and Prague. In 1539 in Venice Mattioli published a booklet entitled Il Magno Palazzo del Cardinale di Trento that constitutes a kind of guide to the new construction desired by Cleese, which also illustrates in detail his pictorial cycles. In a passage of his book, Mattioli strongly addresses those who did not understand or did not appreciate the presence of mutilated figures in the fresco paintings of the palace and explains that the painter he defined wise, saggio that is, well-advised, in this way had explicitly wanted to imitate the example from classical antique works of art. The learned Bartholomaeus Pelton, named Bartholomaeus Amadius, a jurist, a literate and also a music composer, a professor at the University of Ingolstadt, as a young man, and before taking up with the mathematician Petrus Apianus on behalf of banker Raymond Fugge of Augsburg the task of censoring the epigraphs of Roman times preserved in several countries that led to the publication in 1534 of the volume entitled Inscriptions Sacrosanctae Vitestatis, was hosted for a full year at the Trento court of Bernardo Cleese. Bartholomaeus Amadius dedicated various poetic compositions of praise and thanksgiving to Bishop Cleese and conceived an inscription for the funeral monument of his brother, the wretched Giacomo Cleese, who was killed in 1525 in the wake of the collapse of the so-called Peasant War. Finally, in the press work of Amadius and Apianus, two Trento inscriptions of the Roman age walled outside the Church of St. Apollinare were published. The inscription to Caio Valerio Mariano and the inscription to Faustina we can see in the photo below right as it is presented today after the recent restoration of the church. In 1534, inside the new church of Santa Maria Maggiore, of which we have already spoken, as the refined inscription shows, a wealthy Trento merchant, Giovanni Antonio Zerletta, assumed the costs of creating a stone cantoria, an ornate balcony to accommodate the choir accompanying the organ. wanted by Bernardo Cleese and realized by Venetian sculptors at Vincenzo and Gian Girolamo Grandi's workshop. Zurletta is a really interesting person. In 1548, in a plot on the outskirts of the city, he found and dug burials of the Roman age by handing part of the archaeological finds to Prince Bishop Cristoforo Madruzzo, successor to the Cleese, who carefully preserved them in his Wunderkammer. Twice on trial because he professed ideas about religion considered heterodox, Zurletta, who had Calvinist friends, was forced to leave the city and its affairs and take refuge in Lombardy. The cantoria of the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore is entirely covered in fine reliefs in the manner of the ancients. Here we must remember at least one of the bronze busts on the bottom of the cantoria that the scholars of the past, beginning with Michelangelo Mariani, who wrote in 1673, interpreted as prophets, indicating in one of them David, the king of Israel, called by him the king singer, Il Regio Cantori. Apart from this posthumous interpretation, it is evident that the reference taken as a model of the Venetian artists who carried out these works were the busts of the Roman age that the greatest antique collectors were avidly trying to grasp. Comparison with Vitellio, later held by Cardinal Grimani in Venice, several times subject of attention by artists, and a bust of Vitellio preserved today at the Versailles Palace seems entirely eloquent to the purpose. Who took the greatest fruits of Bernardo Cleese's government was his successor, the young Cardinal Cristoforo Madruzzo, guest of the Great Council. A sophisticated and singularly lover of the arts, especially music, introduced to the Germanic courts which like the papal one loved to surround itself with works of art. To the right we see it in the portrait that was made by Tiziano, while the verse of a medal that celebrates him as Optimus Restitutor of the state of Milan, when in 1556 he assumed the leadership as governor on behalf of Philip II of Habsburg, makes you understand how much you appreciate the symbolic and hermetic language of Renaissance art. The secretary of the council Angelo Massarello in his private diary tells the details of his visit to the art and antiquity collection of Madruzzo when the Cardinal of Trento still resided at the Buonconsiglio Castle. The early interest of the Trentino cardinal for the true or supposed relics of antiquity was well known, and in fact it is documented by several sources, some so far unknown. Noteworthy is the fact that in 1548 a citizen of Padua named Marius Michelangelis, or Michelangelo Mari, dedicated to Cristoforo Madruzzo the first print work that sought to explain the hermetic meaning of an epigraph found in Bologna and that at the time he thought to be ancient. This is the funeral inscription for Aemilia Laelia Crispus, which contemporary scholars believe to be a fake made in the humanist or Renaissance era by an enamored expert of antiquities. Considering your particular interest in a comparative look at the reception of the antiquities in the territories of the Empire and in England, I will recall that the second scholar of the slab, known today as Stone of Bologna, was in 1568 Richard White of Basingstoke, an English jurist and historian who attended the University of Padua, called by his Italian friends Riccardo Vito. Following the fashion of the time, Cristoforo Madruzzo built a large villa in the form of a palace surrounded by fish ponds and gardens, outside the medieval walls that still surrounded the city of Trento. By removing it from the church of St. Apollinare Madruzzo, he carried some of the tombstones with Roman inscriptions to his villa, called Palazzo dell'Albere, as evidenced by the inscription he added to the base of the tombstone we see on the left and as witnessed by various scholars who over time examined them carefully in their new location. As Michelangelo Mariani himself did, in his book dedicated to Trento at the time of the council, transcribing the epigraph of the gravestone for Caio Valerio Mariano. Cristoforo Madruzzo is also known to scholars for having purchased or trying to purchase the fine art collection of goldsmith and engraver Vincenzo Valerio Belli, who died in 1546. The collection as well as works of art produced by Belli himself also largely inspired by the art of the ancients, such as the bull hunting medal at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which we see on the left, also included drawings and paintings by great Renaissance artists, such as Michelangelo Buonarroti, and the famous self-portrait in the mirror of Parmigianino, on the right, today kept at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. Cristoforo Madruzzo moved in the middle of the century from Trento to Rome. In 1565 Cristoforo acted as mediator with Cardinal Ippolito II of Este, who bought for Maximilian II of Habsburg 2 genii and 2 satyrs from the Cardinal Rodolfo Pio de' Carpi collection. In those years Maximilian II used the Trentino Prospero Arco several times, son of the poet Niccolò d'Arco, and his ambassador in Rome, to procure ancient works of art and their drawings, ancient statues, busts, vessels and garden and palace drawings that were to serve as a model for new buildings to be built in Vienna and Prague. Prospero d'Arco also made contact with the architect Giovanni Salustio Peruzzi, who had collaborated with the well-cultivated antiquarian Pier Ligorio and made in Rome for Maximilian 2 other smaller statues of new build on the antique model. At the time the same Pope Pio V donated some great ancient statues to Maximilian II which with only great difficulty were brought to Austria. It is certainly not by chance that at the death of Maximilian II in the list of his works there also appears what is termed, I quote, a design of the Cardinal of Trento with 3 nude figures covered with the glass. End of quote. Probably one of the drawings depicting ancient works of art sought after by Prospero d'Arco by the emperor and provided in this case by Madruzzo. Cristoforo Madruzzo for his part in 1576 also became a mediator, seemingly unsuccessful, in buying from Prince Albert V, Duke of Bavaria, for his antiquarium in Munich the ancient art collection of Bishop Girolamo Garimberti. Garimberti, who had died the year before, had been a writer and a learned man. Bound to Cesare Gonzaga and collaborator of Cardinal Otto von Truchess, Prince-Biscop of Augsburg, and fraternal friend of Cristoforo Madruzzo, Garimberti had owned one of the most important Roman collections of his time. The engraver and publisher Giovanni Battista Cavalieri, native of Trentino and protected by the bishops Madruzzo, both Cristoforo and his grandson and successor Ludovico, illustrated many of the ancient works of art collected by Garimberti in the 4th volume of his Antiquarium Statuarum Urbis Romae. We see a table and a detail on his right. To the left we see 2 of the alabaster sculptures from the Garimberti collection that at the beginning of the 16th century Carlo Emanuele I of Savoy bought for himself in Rome and brought to Turin, where they are still preserved in the Royal Museum. But Cristoforo Madruzzo in Rome obtained some ancient works for himself. In his palace in the Borgo district near St. Peter's he could show his guests such as the well-known printer and publisher Aldo Manunzio the Young the stridulated sarcophagus dated between the 3rd and 4th centuries, which we see in the image. This sarcophagus in the 30s of the 15th century had attracted the attention of the famous expert of the antiquity Ciriaco d'Ancona, who saw it at that time in the house of the noble Roman Gaspar Colonna, Archbishop of Benevento and nephew of Pope Martino V. Cristoforo Madruzzo, who built an elegant country residence in Soriano nel Cimino, near Viterbo, when in Rome, in fact, liked to live in a vigna, that is a villa immersed in the garden that he owned on the Quarnale Hill. In the inventory of his legacy set up between 1578 and the following year, after the most valuable works had probably already been saved somewhere else, they are remembered in its Roman properties as well as a lot of silverware also. I quote. A bronze statuette. A large marble statue depicting Hercules. 2 marble basins, one worked and the other simple, certainly 2 antique pieces, and 2 heads of Roman emperors of marble. End of quote. The busts and heads of Roman emperors, as we have seen in the case of Palazzo Tabarelli, have always been the subject of particular attention by those who cultivated the passion for classical antiquity. In one of the halls of the rear body of Palazzo Geremia in Trento, a palace originally built between the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century on the site that had been the decumanus of the Roman Tridentum, we find a series of busts of Roman emperors with plates showing the name, unfortunately very much ruined. The oval shape of the shield bearing the heraldic coat of arms of the Geremia, Pona family and the shape of the bush supports suggestions that the emperor's effigies had been put into operation between the end of the 16th century and the following century. But in Trento there is another bust series of 12 Caesars. We find it in the Roman hallway of Palazzo Roccabruna in Borgo Nuovo. A building that closely recalls the cardinal buildings of Rome and was made by Canon Girolamo Roccabruna, refined and powerful, who was the highest ecclesiastical dignitary of the Church and of the state of Trento in the absence of Bishop Cristoforo Madruzzo and of his successors Ludovico, who also moved to Rome. I'm almost done. So far, we have spoken of principals, bishops, cardinals, jurists, and humanists, families who wanted to consolidate or reinforce their nobility. But in Trentino, the passion for antiquity in the Renaissance period also attracted people of seemingly lesser culture if not of lesser pretensions. In 1564, Giovanni, one of my ancestors, a son of Pellegrino Sameda, did not consider it too exaggerated to remember his father, a simple, although enterprising, timber merchant native from Moena, the day after his assassination as Pauperum Patrii Tutor, honoring him with a funeral marble slab which also in the characteristic form of tabula ansata makes explicit reference to the funerary slabs of ancient Rome. Thank you for your attention. Email giovanni.dellantonio@provincia.tn.ag.dellantonio@gmail.com